In the world of reality TV, the relationships between cast members often seem unbreakable, especially when they've been forged over years of shared experiences. But behind the cameras of Pawn Stars, Austin "Chumlee" Russell's relationship with Rick Harrison began to crack, revealing a more complicated dynamic than fans ever realized. After over a decade of working together, Austin, once seen as Rick's loyal sidekick, began to feel more like a prop in a larger business operation. In a candid interview, Chumlee opens up about the emotional distance and growing disconnect between him and Rick, shedding light on the toll the show took on their personal bond. For the first time, Austin shares the untold truths of his time on the show and the cost of being part of a brand that no longer valued him as a person. The humble beginnings. In the early days, Rick Harrison, Corey's father, and the owner of the gold and silver pawn shop, was no celebrity. He was, however, a shrewd businessman with a sharp eye for valuable items and a no-nonsense approach to life. It was Rick who first noticed Austin, then just a young man with no particular career ambitions beyond helping his friend Corey. Rick welcomed him into the fold of the family business, offering him a job that would later change his life forever. Initially, Austin's role at the shop was humble. He started off with small tasks, cleaning, running errands, and assisting with minor jobs around the shop. It was a steady progression, but one that felt right. Rick never pressured Austin, nor did he expect instant results. Instead, Rick offered a quiet, patient mentorship that helped Austin develop a solid work ethic. For Austin, the value of this simple yet profound support couldn't be overstated. This was more than just a job. It was an opportunity to learn under someone he respected, a mentor and, in many ways, a father figure. The early days were the most comfortable, when the gold and silver pawn shop was just a small business with no illusions of grandeur. It wasn't yet the iconic television set it would soon become. Austin and the rest of the crew worked side by side, bonding over shared experiences. At the time, it was simply about running a business, making deals, and living life on their own terms. However, that would all change once the cameras arrived. The transformation. Pawn Stars and the spotlight. When Pawn Stars first started filming, the transformation of the gold and silver pawn shop from a local pawn business to a global phenomenon was immediate and dramatic. The show exploded in popularity, and with it, the shop's brand began to take on a life of its own. What had been a modest family-run business now became a focal point for millions of viewers, and the members of the Harrison family, Rick, Corey, and Austin, became overnight celebrities. For Austin, the shift was both exhilarating and disorienting. What had once been a place of comfort and camaraderie was now a high-pressure production set. The fun and spontaneity of the shop's day-to-day operations were replaced by the demands of television production. Austin, once a background figure, was now thrust into the spotlight as Chumlee, the comedic foil to Rick's business-savvy, no-nonsense persona. Austin's natural humor and awkward charm quickly became the heart of the show. The fans loved him for his ability to provide comic relief, even if his knowledge of antiques wasn't as deep as Rick's or Corey's. Rick's role in this transformation was pivotal. Once a mentor who imparted his business acumen to Austin, Rick was now thrust into the limelight as the wise, authoritative figure at the center of the show. His knowledge of history, antiques, and negotiation became central to the show's appeal. While Austin's role shifted to that of the comic relief, Rick's role became more rigid. He became more of a businessman than a father figure, and their relationship began to evolve from one of mutual respect to one of distance. The subtle shift, the price of fame. As Pawn Stars became a massive success, The dynamics within the Harrison family and within the shop itself began to change. The warm, familial bond that had once existed between Rick, Corey, and Austin started to erode as the demands of the show intensified. Rick, who had once treated Austin like a second son, was now operating more like a CEO, concerned with ratings, merchandise deals, and brand partnerships. The shop that had once felt like home to Austin was now increasingly a business, and that business was run like a high-stakes production set. The shift was subtle at first, but it soon became undeniable. As Pawn Stars became more scripted and commercialized, Austin began to feel the distance between himself and Rick grow. No longer did they share the late-night talks or the collaborative brainstorming sessions. Instead, their interactions became more transactional, driven by the needs of the show, rather than by any genuine familial connection. Austin could sense that he was no longer seen as a valued member of the family, but as another piece in the puzzle, a cog in the wheel of a machine that was rapidly expanding. Despite this growing distance, Austin remained fiercely loyal to Rick. He knew that the opportunities he had been given were a result of Rick's generosity, and he was grateful for that. However, the weight of the changing dynamics was not lost on him. The laughter they once shared, the fun of working together, now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a tense, business-focused environment. And though Austin was still a beloved figure on television, he often wondered whether he was truly seen as part of the family anymore, or just another character on a scripted show. The strain beneath the surface. As Pawn Stars continued to grow in popularity, the pressure on Rick and the rest of the cast increased. The cameras never stopped rolling, and the demands of the show became more intense. Rick, whose leadership had once been admired by Austin, became increasingly controlling behind the scenes. While the show claimed to be unscripted, it became clear that many of the scenes were heavily rehearsed. Rick began to discourage improvisation, wanting everything to go according to plan. His desire for perfection created a stressful atmosphere, and Austin found himself walking on eggshells. On more than one occasion, Rick openly criticized Austin, particularly when it came to his on-camera persona. Rick's sharp tongue, which had once been tempered with care, now seemed more biting. One comment that particularly stung was when Rick told Austin, "Chum, you've got to stop playing the fool so much. People are going to think you're an idiot." Austin had always prided himself on his humor, but hearing Rick, the man who had once mentored him, make such a statement in front of the crew cut deeply. It wasn't just a comment about his performance on television, it felt like a personal rejection. Rick's criticism, once lighthearted and playful, became sharper, more pointed. There were moments when it seemed like Rick's desire to maintain control of the show was overshadowing any sense of empathy or understanding. Austin, who had grown used to the close-knit family environment, now found himself feeling isolated and disconnected. The warmth and affection that had once defined his relationship with Rick had been replaced by a cold, business-like attitude. The breaking point. Chumlee's personal struggles. As the show's success grew, so did the pressure on Austin. What had begun as a lighthearted, spontaneous role on Pawn Stars now seemed like a gilded cage. Fame, which had initially been thrilling, began to feel suffocating. Austin's every move was scrutinized by the public and the media. His off-camera mistakes, which might have once been overlooked, were now sensationalized and turned into headlines. It became clear that Austin was no longer just a pawnshop employee. He was a brand, a commodity, and his personal life was just as much a part of the show as the antiques being sold. The pressure mounted, and Austin found himself struggling with the loss of the person he once was. He no longer felt like a real part of the family. His relationship with Rick had changed so much that it was almost unrecognizable. The mentor, who had once guided him with patience and understanding, now seemed like a distant figure, more concerned with maintaining the success of Pawn Stars than with the well-being of those who had helped build it. The family dynamic that had been so central to Austin's life was being replaced by the relentless demands of fame and the business side of television. The final blow came when Austin tried to venture into something that was truly his own: a candy shop and memorabilia store. It was a passion project, something that reflected his interests outside of Pawn Stars. But when he approached Rick with the idea, he was met with indifference. There were no words of encouragement, no praise for his entrepreneurial spirit. Instead, Austin could sense that Rick saw the venture as a distraction, perhaps even a threat. It was clear that Rick didn't see this as a new opportunity for Austin. He saw it as competition to the empire they had built together. The loneliness of fame. In the end, the fame and success that Pawn Stars had brought to Austin came at a cost. He had achieved everything he had once dreamed of: financial stability, a devoted fan base, and the kind of recognition that most people would envy. But beneath the surface, Austin found himself feeling more isolated than ever before. The laughter, the camaraderie, the feeling of being part of something bigger than himself. It had all been replaced by a cold, corporate atmosphere. The gold and silver pawn shop, once a place of family and friendship, had become a television set, and the family he had once felt so connected to now felt like distant co-workers. For Austin, the cost of fame had been the loss of something far more valuable: his sense of self. The man he had been before Pawn Stars was slipping away, and the persona of Chumlee was taking over. As the cameras rolled and the brand expanded, Austin found himself questioning who he was and what he had become. Was he still the young man who had walked into the pawn shop years ago, eager to learn and grow? Or had he become a mere character, trapped in the confines of a persona that the world had created for him? The tension between Austin and Rick only grew as time went on. The warmth and mentorship Rick had once provided had been replaced by cold business decisions and sharp criticisms. The mentor, who had once been so close, had now become a distant figure, and Austin was left to grapple with the realization that the price of fame and success might have been the loss of the very things that had once made life meaningful. In the end, Austin's journey from a quiet, loyal friend to a global television star had changed him in ways he never could have imagined. Fame, which had promised so much, had taken far more than it had given. And as Pawn Stars continued to dominate the airwaves, Austin Russell was left to face the difficult truth. The world might know him as Chumlee, but the man behind the character was struggling to find his way. Austin's return from vacation. The silent shift Austin Chumlee. Russell had been struggling for some time. Burnout had begun to creep into his life, wearing him down emotionally and mentally. The relentless pace of filming for Pawn Stars, the pressure to perform for both the cameras and the fans, and the constant scrutiny from the public had begun to take a toll. Even though he was surrounded by people, Austin often felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. He had become a character, a punchline to many, and he began to wonder if anyone, especially his longtime mentor and friend, Rick Harrison, still saw him as more than just the funny guy on television. He decided to take a break, a short vacation, to clear his mind and recalibrate. It was supposed to be a rejuvenating escape, a chance to reconnect with himself outside the glare of the cameras. But as he walked back into the gold and silver pawn shop on his first day back, he could already feel the cold shift in the air. Rick barely acknowledged him when he returned, which, to Austin, was telling. It wasn't just that Rick was preoccupied, it was something more. It was the silence, the subtle indifference, the kind of coldness that only someone who had once been close could administer. The awkwardness loomed over Austin as he rejoined the crew. Then, later that day, in front of several crew members, Rick made a remark that felt like a stab to Austin's heart. "Well, nice of you to show up. We didn't even notice you were gone," Rick quipped. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Everyone laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that sounded forced, more like nervous energy than genuine amusement. Austin, however, didn't laugh. He simply stood there, feeling the weight of the words. The sting wasn't in the words themselves. They were cutting, but Austin had heard worse. But in the look in Rick's eyes, it wasn't a joke, it wasn't playful, it was a message that something fundamental had shifted. A growing emotional divide. Rick Harrison had always prided himself on running a tight ship. The pawn shop wasn't just a family business. It was a brand, a global symbol, something that needed constant attention and careful management. Austin had always been a loyal part of that ship, a team player who helped craft the show's humor and appeal. But over time, Rick's focus seemed to move further away from the people who made the business what it was, and towards maintaining the brand's success and public image. This shift became painfully apparent when Austin faced legal troubles in 2016. The public backlash was swift and brutal. News outlets and social media exploded with coverage of Austin's legal issues, painting a picture of a man caught in the grips of his own mistakes. But inside the shop, where Austin hoped for some sign of solidarity, there was nothing. Rick, the man who had once taken Austin under his wing, who had mentored him through the ups and downs of building a public persona, had gone quiet. There were no public statements of support, not even a private word of comfort. Austin never expected Rick to publicly defend him, but he hoped for something. A check-in, a text, a simple, "Are you okay?" Instead, Rick seemed focused solely on distancing the brand from the situation. "We have an image to maintain," Rick reportedly told a crew member in reference to Austin's troubles. To Austin, it felt like abandonment. While Rick, the businessman, worked to protect the Pawn Stars brand, Corey Harrison, Rick's son, and Austin's childhood friend, reached out. Corey wasn't going to excuse Austin's actions, but he reminded him that they were still friends. Corey's encouragement to stay strong, to work on himself, felt like a lifeline in the midst of the storm. That small gesture, one that came with no camera crew or social media fanfare, was a reminder that not everyone had abandoned him. Still, the damage had been done. The wedge between Austin and Rick had deepened. Austin tried to rebuild the relationship. He apologized for his past mistakes. He suggested ways he could contribute more to the business, offering to take on greater responsibility, hoping to be seen as more than just the comic relief. But Rick's responses were always vague, promising things that never materialized. "We'll see," Rick would say, but those words lacked the conviction they once held. Over time, Austin began to question whether the shop, the brand, and his relationship with Rick had become more important to Rick than the people who had helped build it. The indifference that cut the deepest. Despite the emotional turmoil he was facing, Austin kept showing up. He still smiled for the fans, still played the part of the lovable goofball. But inside, the connection was gone. Rick's indifference hurt more than any criticism ever could. Criticism could be worked through. It was a challenge to be met, something that could fuel growth. But apathy? Apathy was a silent killer. It eroded the very foundation of their relationship. Austin never spoke out publicly about the situation at the time. He didn't want to stir up drama or risk burning bridges. But the betrayal, the abandonment, was a constant weight on his shoulders. It wasn't the kind of betrayal that comes with loud arguments or public explosions. It was quiet, insidious, and far more painful. When you've been treated like family for over a decade, being ignored, being made to feel invisible, stings in ways that the public could never understand. Corey's silence. A friend caught in the middle. Throughout the growing tension between Austin and Rick, one person remained mostly silent: Corey Harrison. As Rick's son and Austin's childhood friend, Corey found himself in an incredibly difficult position. He was torn between family loyalty and his deep friendship with Austin. Corey and Austin had grown up together. They were like brothers, spending their childhoods riding bikes, playing video games, and later working side by side in the pawn shop, long before the cameras ever showed up. That kind of bond, forged through years of shared experiences, wasn't easy to break. But as the tension between Rick and Austin mounted, Corey had to straddle two worlds: the family business and the loyalty to his oldest friend. Austin remembers a quiet moment during filming when the weight of the situation became unbearable. He had just finished another long day of shooting, and Rick had barely acknowledged his presence. It was becoming harder for Austin to ignore the emotional toll this was taking. During a break, Corey pulled him aside and said, "I know it's rough, man. He's harder on you than anyone else. I see it too." That single sentence, simple, quiet, and empathetic, meant more to Austin than anything Rick had said in years. For the first time, someone acknowledged what he was feeling. But despite Corey's empathy, he rarely intervened when things became tense. Whether it was out of fear of upsetting his father or simply not wanting to get caught in the middle, Corey often chose to remain a passive observer. At times, Corey did try to mediate. He would joke to ease the tension or subtly redirect Rick's criticisms into something more constructive. But as Pawn Stars grew from a reality show into a global brand, Corey seemed to retreat into a more passive role. He appeared more focused on maintaining a good relationship with Rick, the patriarch of the family business, than on addressing the emotional divide that was growing between Rick and Austin. The breaking point. When silence becomes betrayal. The breaking point came not in one explosive argument, but in the cumulative weight of small moments. The dismissive remarks, the cold shoulders, the feeling of being a prop rather than a person. It all added up. One incident stands out in particular. During a special episode, a guest expert came in to evaluate a rare collection, and Austin, having done his research, was excited to contribute to the conversation. He was cut off mid-sentence by Rick. "Why don't you let the experts talk, chum?" Rick said, without even looking at him. That moment was more than just an awkward dismissal. It was a stark reminder of how far their relationship had deteriorated. The crew fell silent, sensing the tension. Austin stood there, nodding, suppressing his frustration. He had been in the pawn shop long enough to know when something was wrong, and that moment crystallized everything. It wasn't about the words. It was about the tone, the indifference, the lack of recognition. Austin went home that night and seriously questioned his future on Pawn Stars. Was this still worth it? Had he become just another character in a scripted reality show, destined to be a punchline and nothing more? When he tried to address the growing divide with Rick, it was clear that Rick had no interest in working through the issues. "It's showbiz," Rick replied. "You play your part, I play mine." That comment marked the point of no return for Austin. The bond they once shared, built on years of friendship, mentorship, and mutual respect, was gone. In its place was a business relationship, one governed by scripted roles and brand priorities. Rebuilding and moving forward. As the emotional distance between Austin and Rick grew, Austin began to focus on his own ventures. He realized that the pawn shop, once a family business, had become a brand, and he was no longer at the center of it. It was time to carve out his own identity. He started working on Chumlee's Candy on the Boulevard, a candy shop located just steps away from the gold and silver pawn shop. It was more than just a business. It was a symbol of his desire to be seen for who he was, not just as a sidekick to Rick's dominant presence on the show. Austin found fulfillment in running his candy shop, a place where he could interact with fans without the pressure of playing a character. He also began investing in other ventures, including real estate and digital branding, showing a level of business acumen that few had expected from him. His personal growth was evident. He shed weight, focused on his health and wellness, and surrounded himself with people who supported him. For the first time in a long while, Austin felt respected, not for the jokes he told, but for who he was. The shadows of Pawn Stars still lingered, but Austin was no longer defined by it. He had moved beyond the cameras and the scripted roles, and he was ready to define his future on his terms.